This presentation on the Saturn manual transaxle has 4 parts which cover components and operation, diagnosis and inspection, transaxle removal, and systems removal. The 1991 Saturn Coupe SC and both the Saturn Sedan SL1 and SL2 are available with Saturn's 5-speed manual transaxle. However, 2 different versions of this transaxle are used, each with different gear ratios. All Saturn vehicles are available with the 1.9-liter L4 single overhead cam engine with throttle body injection, or TBI. The TBI engine uses a version of the 5-speed manual transaxle with the identification code MP2. The Saturn 1.9-liter double overhead cam multi-port fuel injection, or MFI engine, is also available in all vehicles. The MFI engine uses a version of the 5-speed manual transaxle with the identification code MP3. Remember, the MP2 and MP3 use different gear ratios, which are listed in the service manual. Except for the difference in gear ratios, both versions are identical. The 5-speed manual transaxle features an aluminum case, synchronized forward and reverse gears, and has a fluid capacity of 2.6 quarts Dexron 2 ATF. Reverse gear features a brake that stops input shaft rotation just before engagement of the sliding reverse idler gear. The synchronizers have powdered metal blocking rings with composite friction linings. The sleeve design uses circular springs and no struts. The transaxle consists of a case and housing assembly, an input shaft, an output shaft, a final drive differential, a reverse idler gear, and a shift mechanism, which is not shown. The transaxle case and housing assembly supports the input shaft with a roller bearing, which is part of an assembly including the input shaft oil seal and clutch release bearing guide in the clutch housing, and a sealed ball bearing, which uses a retaining ring that allows the case to properly position the input shaft. The output shaft is supported by a roller bearing in the clutch housing and a sealed ball bearing in the case. The bearing has a retaining ring that allows the case to position the output shaft. The differential case is supported by 2 ball bearings. These bearings are pressed onto the differential case and slide into bores in the transaxle case and clutch housing. The reverse idler gear has a pressed bushing. The gear assembly is supported in the case by the reverse idler shaft. Caged needle-type roller bearings provide radial support to these GEARSET parts. The reverse cone, 5th-speed drive gear, 4th-speed drive gear, 3rd-speed drive gear, 2nd-speed driven gear, and the 1st-speed driven gear. A thrust surface on the input shaft and the 3/4 synchronizer hub provides axial thrust support for the 3rd-speed drive gear. The 3/4 synchronizer hub and a thrust washer give the 4th-speed drive gear its axial thrust support. The 5 reverse synchronizer hub and a thrust washer provide the 5th-speed drive gear with axial thrust support. The reverse cone has similar support. The 2nd-speed driven gear gets axial thrust support from the 3rd/4 driven gear and the 1/2 synchronizer hub. 1st-speed driven gear is contained axially by a thrust surface on the 1/2 synchronizer hub and a needle-type thrust bearing. The 1/2 and 3/4 shift forks use bushings made of composite material that allows them to slide easily on the shift fork shaft. The forks use composite pads which provide a durable running surface. The shift shaft uses machined bushings in bores in the shift control housing for its support. The shaft and housing are included in the shift control housing assembly. The clutch housing uses a ball stud type pivot that supports the clutch release fork. The proper oil level in the 5-speed manual transaxle allows the lubrication system to work as designed. External portions of the gears are lubricated by oil splash. For internal lubrication, the gears throw oil against the case, and an oil flow tube catches some of the oil. The tube directs oil to the rear cover trough. The trough directs oil to the guide tube, which helps send oil to all parts of the center passage of the input shaft. Centrifugal force causes the oil to flow through lube passages in the input shaft to lubricate the gearset bearings. Oil splash is caught in a trough in the clutch housing. It directs oil through a guide tube and a filter to the lube passage of the output shaft. Again, centrifugal force causes the oil to flow through lube passages in the output shaft to lubricate the gearset bearings. The 5-speed manual transaxle uses seals and gaskets in the following locations: a lip seal for the input shaft, which is part of the input shaft roller bearing assembly, lip seals for the drive axles, and gaskets at these case surfaces: the clutch housing flange, the rear cover flange, and the shift housing flange. There's also an O-ring seal for the vehicle speed sensor, thread sealant for the backup lamp switch, and an aluminum washer for the drain plug. A vent attaches to a fitting on the shift control housing. Remember that the orientation of the vent hose and valve are very important to prevent road splash from entering the inside of the transaxle. To check the transaxle fluid level, remove and inspect the dipstick when the fluid is cold. Now let's look at the internal power flow. This is the power flow through the first speed gear set, through the second speed gear set, through the third speed gear set, through the fourth speed gear set, and through the fifth speed gear set. In reverse, a brake cone stops input shaft rotation and is free by the time the reverse idler gear is in position. Then power flows through the reverse gear set. In this section, we'll cover diagnosis and inspection procedures. Begin your diagnosis of any problem with the 5-speed manual transaxle by studying the customer service order. Check the CSO for customer complaints in one or more of 3 malfunction categories: fluid leak, excessive noise, or improper operation. Next, perform a visual inspection, both topside and underside. Inspect the master cylinder for fluid leaks, low fluid, or contaminated fluid. Check the hydraulic damper and slave cylinder for fluid leaks. Check the hydraulic lines for fluid leaks or damage. Under the vehicle, check for damage from road hazards and for any fluid leakage from the clutch housing, the sealing surfaces, and the drive axle seals. Now it's time to perform 3 quick shift tests: static, which helps find shift system faults; dynamic, which helps find clutch system faults; and a road shift test that helps find both while it puts an operating load on all internal parts. To perform the static test, press the clutch pedal in. Shift the transaxle into all speeds to align the parts. Release the clutch pedal. Now shift the transaxle into all speeds. Feel for shift effort and listen for any unusual noises. To conduct a dynamic test, press the clutch pedal in and start the engine, allowing it to idle. With the lever in neutral, release the clutch pedal and note any unusual operation or noises. Now press the clutch in and shift to first. Release the clutch pedal and let the vehicle move slightly. Be careful not to allow excessive slipping of the clutch in third, fourth, and fifth, as damage to the clutch can occur. Conduct a road shift test by driving the vehicle in all speeds, including reverse. If necessary, road test with the owner to observe any unusual operation or noises. Once you've verified the malfunction exists, start a more in-depth diagnosis using the Saturn service manual. The clutch system diagnostic chart lists complaints or conditions and suggests possible causes. The most likely causes are identified with large marks, so check those items first. The transaxle diagnostic chart also suggests likely causes. Further diagnosis requires removal and disassembly of the transaxle, which we'll cover later. Now let's turn to transaxle part inspection and repair. After disassembling the transaxle, wear appropriate safety equipment and wash all parts with solvent. Then dry the parts with compressed air. Now inspect the damaged sealing surfaces, the clutch housing, the rear cover, transaxle case, and the shift housing assembly. And inspect the differential case and gear set. Also inspect all the shift system parts. Thoroughly examine the bearing and thrust surfaces of the input and output shafts and gears, plus the reverse idler shaft and gear. Now inspect the bearings for excessive wear, including the differential case ball bearings, those on the input shaft and output shafts, the bearings for driven gears and drive gears, including their inner races, and inspect the reverse cone on the 5th reverse synchronizer hub. Now inspect the gear set teeth for chips or excessive wear. Always replace damaged mating gears. Now inspect the synchronizers. After marking the synchronizer parts for matched reassembly, disassemble them to check the fit between the hub and sleeve. Binding can cause a hard shift. Check the condition of the blocking ring composite friction lining and the gear cone clutch surface. Major wear causes gear clash. Check the gear clutch tooth and sleeve tooth chamfers. Damage here may be due to blocking ring wear. Check the sleeve tooth sides. Damaged notches may cause hop out. Check the sleeve tooth surfaces which contact the circular spring. Damage here may cause a hard shift or shift blockout. Also check the blocking ring surfaces that contact the circular spring. Here, damage may cause shift blockout or gear clash. Check the blocking ring tooth chamfers too. Damage may cause shift blockout. Check the blocking ring lugs and hub notches. Wear here could also cause shift blockout. And finally, check the circular spring. Damage to it may cause shift blockout or gear clash. Of course, you should replace gaskets, clips, pins, or any other worn or damaged parts found during these inspections. Then reassemble the transaxle and install it in the vehicle. But you're not done yet. Your final task is to verify the repair. The procedures are the same as with symptom identification. Start with a visual inspection, both underside and topside, for fluid leaks. Perform a static test to feel for shift effort and listen for any unusual noises. Conduct a dynamic test to discover any unusual clutch operation or noises. And road test the vehicle in all speeds, including reverse. After you've verified the repair, complete the customer service order and give yourself a pat on the back for doing it right the first time. This section covers transaxle removal and installation. To remove the transaxle, first put the vehicle on a hoist. Remove the air induction tube for access and disconnect the battery negative terminal. Remove the battery cover, battery, and battery tray. Separate the electrical connectors for the backup light switch, the vehicle speed sensor, and the ground wiring at the clutch housing studs. Unclip the oxygen sensor wire from the front transaxle mount bracket. On MFI engines, remove the motion restrictor cable bracket at the cradle. Remove the top 2 clutch housing to engine block studs. Then install a special guide stud in place of the top rear stud for the clutch housing. Remove the ignition module coil assembly from the clutch housing. Use wire to support the removed parts. Remove the 2 transaxle mount to transaxle bolts. Remove the shift control cables from the shift arms and clutch housing. Remove the clutch hydraulic system from the clutch housing in 3 steps. First, remove the 2 mounting nuts and the hydraulic damper. Remove the slave cylinder by pushing and rotating it counterclockwise for 1/4 turn. Use wire to support the removed parts from the battery tray. Now assemble and install the SA9105E engine support bar and place it in the engine compartment. Connect the bar hooks to the engine brackets and position the stabilizer foot on the engine. Also use wire to support the radiator to the vehicle body. Now remove both front wheels and raise the vehicle. Drain the transaxle fluid. Separate the left, right, and front splash shields by removing the fasteners from the frame. The front splash shield also has 2 retaining screws. Both the left and right lower ball joints must be removed, using care not to damage the ABS sensing ring. Remove the cotter pin, partially remove the nut, then use tool SA9132S to push the stud from the knuckle. Next, remove the exhaust downpipe. Remove the pipe to exhaust manifold nuts. Remove the exhaust pipe bracket bolts. Remove the catalytic converter to pipe bolts. And lower the pipe from its mounting. Remove the rear mount bracket retaining bolts from the transaxle. Loosen the mount through bolt and allow the bracket to hang down. Using both a socket and box wrench, separate the steering gear from the cradle. Also unclip the brake lines from the cradle. Remove the nuts from the engine to cradle mount and the nut from the transaxle to cradle mount. Remove the 6 bolts for the stiffening bracket. Then remove the dust cover, which has 3 bolts. Lower the vehicle and place the powertrain dolly under the cradle. Remove the 4 cradle-to-body bolts and lower the cradle using the dolly. Using a large screwdriver or pry bar, separate the left drive axle from the transaxle. Remove and support the drive axle. Remove the bottom 2 clutch housing to engine block bolts. Install a guide stud in place of the bottom rear bolt for the clutch housing. Now, separate the transaxle from the engine. To install the Saturn 5-speed manual transaxle, follow the removal procedures in reverse order. Your Saturn service manual has step-by-step instructions. It also lists torque values for tightening all nuts, bolts, and fasteners during installation. During installation of the transaxle, remember to remove all support wires after reattaching components, and be sure to reconnect all electrical connectors, including the ground wire at the clutch housing studs. Fill the transaxle with Dexron 2 ATF. Install and connect the battery, then install the air induction tube, and verify the repair. This section on systems removal and replacement covers clutch mechanical system removal and replacement, clutch hydraulic system replacement, shift control cable replacement, and left and right drive axle seal replacement. After removing the transaxle, you may need to remove the clutch mechanical system. First, remove the release fork and bearing from the transaxle by unsnapping the fork from the pivot stud. Separate the release bearing from the fork and inspect it for excessive movement or drag. Do not wash the sealed release bearing in solvent. Use a feeler gauge to measure the clutch disc installed thickness. Minimum thickness is listed in the service manual. Replace the disc if necessary. Remove the 6 pressure plate to flywheel bolts. To prevent pressure plate warpage, remove the bolts in a progressive crisscross pattern. Separate the pressure plate and disc from the flywheel. Inspect the pressure plate for excessive wear or cracks and overheating. Black spotting is common and should be considered normal. Also measure the pressure plate for warpage using a straight edge and feeler gauge. The maximum warpage limit is listed in the service manual. If necessary, replace the pressure plate. Inspect the clutch disc for oil contamination or burned facing material, and loose damper springs or rivets. If necessary, replace the clutch disc. Inspect the flywheel for ring gear tooth damage, excessive wear or cracks, and overheating. Measure flywheel runout using a dial indicator. First, push the crankshaft forward. Now, rotate the crankshaft 2 revolutions. Maximum runout is 0.15 millimeters or 6/1000 inches. Remove the 8 mounting bolts. Note that these bolts are blue in color. Then, separate the flywheel from the crankshaft. To install the flywheel, start the bolts by hand and then tighten in a crisscross pattern. Be sure to tighten the bolts to the torque specification in the service manual. Install the clutch disc on the flywheel using the SA9145T clutch alignment tool to hold it in position. Align the flywheel and pressure plate marks and start the pressure plate bolts by hand. Tighten the bolts progressively in a crisscross pattern to evenly seat the pressure plate to the flywheel. When seated, torque bolts as specified in the service manual. Remove the alignment tool. Attach a new retaining clip if necessary to the fork. Lubricate the transaxle input shaft splines and the release fork pivot. Then, install the fork on its pivot. Do not use lube on the release bearing. If the problem was in the clutch mechanical system, you are now ready to install the transaxle. If you need to remove the clutch hydraulic system, start by removing the air induction tube, battery, and tray for access, and removing the push rod retainer clip and disconnecting the push rod from the clutch pedal. This is done so that the hydraulic system cannot be cycled. Next, remove the hydraulic damper from the clutch housing by removing the 2 nuts with a hand socket and driver. It should be noted that using a power driver can cause the hydraulic line to be broken off the slave body due to its quick reverse movement and possible jamming against the line. Push and rotate the slave cylinder in a counterclockwise direction for 1/4 turn. It should be loose from the clutch housing. Rotate the master cylinder in a clockwise direction 1/8 turn. Pull to remove it from the square-keyed hole in the dash panel. Now, remove the complete hydraulic system from the engine compartment. Installation of the clutch hydraulic system is simply the reverse procedure, but make sure the slave actuator rod goes in straight so it properly engages the release fork. Also remember that the 2 nuts which fasten the hydraulic damper to the clutch housing must be torqued to the specifications in the service manual. To replace the shift control cable, first remove the air induction tube. Now remove the retainers and cable-to-clutch housing retaining clips at the cable ends. Lift the cable out of the clutch housing bracket to avoid boot damage. Inside the vehicle, you must first remove the console according to instructions in the service manual. Remove the bolt from the cable retaining plate and the plate itself. Remove the plastic cable guide from the shifter. Now use 2 flat screwdrivers to separate the select cable and shift cable from the shifter bell crank. Then separate the sound deadening material covering the cable grommet at the front of the dash. Raise the vehicle and push the cable grommet from the dash. Then lower the vehicle. To install the shift control cables, place the cables through the dash front and use pliers to pull the grommet into the hole. When connecting the cables to the shift arms, remember to install the retainers with the correct side up. And when installing the cable retainer plate, remember to torque its bolts to the specification in the service manual. To replace a left drive axle seal without removing the transaxle, first remove the left front wheel, raise the vehicle, and drain the transaxle fluid. Then remove the left lower ball joint just as you would when removing the transaxle. Remove the cotter pin. Use tool SA9132S to push the stud from the knuckle. Then fully remove the nut. Using a large screwdriver or pry bar, separate the left drive axle from the transaxle. Remove and support the drive axle. Now use tool SA9133T to remove the left drive axle seal. screw the tool end into a dust cover hole. Remove the dust cover. Then screw the tool into the seal body as close to the outside diameter as possible. And remove the seal with the tool. Install a new seal with tool SA9113T and a hammer. Install the drive axle into the transaxle. Be careful not to allow the spline or retaining ring on the axle to drag across the lip surface of the new seal. Now install the left lower ball joint, tightening the nut to the torque specification in the service manual using a new cotter pin. Make sure you do not tear the drive axle outer joint boot. Lower the vehicle and install the left front wheel. Then fill the transaxle with Dexron 2 ATF and test for proper repair. Right drive axle seal replacement is the same as with the left side, up to the point of removing the lower ball joint. Then you have to separate the right drive axle and intermediate drive shaft from the transaxle. First, remove the intake manifold support bracket if equipped and the bracket stud. Remove the cranking motor support bolt. Now remove the intermediate drive shaft support bolt and pivot the bracket. Remove the drive axle and the intermediate shaft from the transaxle and support them. Remove the axle seal in 2 steps. First, remove the dust shield. Then remove the seal itself. Install the right seal the same way you install a left seal, making sure you don't damage the lip surface. This concludes the video training material on Saturn's manual transaxle.